Darkly Splendid Abodes, the official podcast of Toronto Thelema, exploring, if you will, practical philosophy, from science and the workings of the mind to spirituality, esotericism, and magic. Stooping down, dipping my wings, I came into the darkly splendid abodes. Welcome to another deep dip, where we will be exploring a particular book more fully. Today we'll revisit the essay by Jack Parsons entitled, Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword. We'll look at the remaining chapters we hadn't gotten to in our previous discussion, and explore more deeply its thesis of woman taking hold of the sword of freedom. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Part 2 of our little talk on Jack Parsons' paper.
This is the first, I don't know how you're going to cut these up when you publish them, but this is the first time we've done a part 2. This is the first time we've come back for a second sitting on something. So I can't ask you how the text struck you the first time you looked at it. So
well, you certainly can.
Our slow ease in is missing. Off mic a month ago, we talked about the two definitions of sublimation. Was it? Did you want to say something about, you had an idea that it meant two different things. Do you want to say what it is to sublimate?
Yeah, I suppose what I was thinking of when I was looking at this, because I did a cursory search for the definition of sublimation, which turned up something that I didn't think it was, because I think it was a scientific application of the term. So I decided to dig a little deeper and sort of got the sense that it was something to take something and make it sublime, in the sense of like being beyond, no longer just in the mundane sense or in the physical sense or whatnot. So in this case, if we're talking about sublimation of the sexual instinct, that would be making it into something no longer actually carnal. So it would be the religious sublimation of the sexual instinct, in my mind, would have been to essentially take the sexual instinct, cover it with a bunch of shame, and then try to redirect it into a purified or rarefied form towards God and towards the religious life, so that you no longer realize that you're actually dealing with the sexual instinct anymore.
And there's a whole bunch of this explicit in mystic practice throughout the centuries. It's not what I... super interesting. I had not thought of it as having that etymology before, sublimity or sublimation coming from the sublime. So that's weird. I think not weird, but interesting to me. I think there's a Freudian definition where all actions become libidinous. So you have your primary sexual urge, and then that gets redirected into other sorts of activities as you mature. And so the secret motivation behind all mature pursuits is libidinal, and we sublimate these urges into our productivity and do kind of awesome stuff with these more primal instincts. So how is Parsons using it here? At the beginning of chapter 2, the woman was insulted and affronted with the calumny? The woman was insulted and affronted with the calumny of immaculate conception. Then, by this mystery-mongering, a premium was placed on moral and spiritual sterility. This sublimation of the sex urge has been the basis of the power of the church and is the source of much of the psychosis rampant in the modern world. So both of the definitions we've come up with so far have this positive tinge, one of directing sexual energy towards spiritual aspiration, and the other of directing sexual energy towards all aspiration soever. Is there an essential denial of the sex instinct in both of those redirects?
I think that's the problem that Jack is trying to emphasize here. When I was reading through this on the first reading recently, I was noticing the fact that, I was also noticing the term coming up in some of Crowley's writing. I think it was in the Confessions, and he was speaking in a positive light about, just as you're saying, with sublimation of things into the spiritual and that sort of thing. Sublimation of the sex instinct into the higher realms of the soul, so to speak, but he was speaking of it in a positive light, and I thought that was an interesting contrast with the way that Jack Parsons is dealing with it here. So like you say, it does seem to be a little bit of a negative light that he's dealing with it. Incidentally, calumny is the making of false and defamatory statements about someone in order to damage their reputation.
Oh, cool.
So slander.
Cool. Calumny.
Calumny.
Calumny. Calumny.
Calumny.
You're columnist?
Calumny. Maybe
Columnist?
it is calumny. I don't know. I don't know where the emphasis...
Columnist.
But back to the topic at hand, I suppose.
No, this is good. And somewhere, it might have even been in the new Jerry Cornelius book that I just got. But it says that Freud thinks all willing is derived from sex, and Jung thinks that sex is one of the manifestations of willing. And so Jung is, in the Thelemic conception, maybe doing a better job than Freud. And a couple of places, we've glossed it, but in a couple of the readings we've read lately, Crowley accuses Freud of being like puerile or juvenile or something like this, of being sex obsessed. And so Cornelius may be right about this thing, about how, and I think it's explicit in some of the literature that when Crowley says will is primary, he doesn't mean like the libidinal will. He means something more about going and expanding, and the sex becomes
and some of the places that Crowley talks about this subject, he does seem to be saying that that sexuality and the sex instinct is a manifestation of will rather than the other way around. Or so it sounds like he's more on the page with Jung rather than Freud in that sense.
Somewhere here, Parsons will say that it's really important to understand how important sex actually is, but also how it's overemphasized in modern life. So this could be the turn that he's pointing at, this idea of sex as being seen as I think primary and dangerous.
He has a point, too, because it's, he's talking about it in the context of, he's always talking about things in terms of the church when he's speaking negatively about the old times, pretty much. So he's talking about the way that the church repressed the sexual instinct by making it shameful and trying to sublimate it in the sense of repressing it shamefully and then channeling that energy instead into the otherworldly at the expense of this world. So completely negating this world and negating life and the physical realm and that sort of thing.
Last time we discussed this, I think we got through the first chapter and the preface, which were sort of about how, governments are not comported towards freedom, and talked about the importance of liberty for human flourishing and the value of the project of liberalism. I think Thelemites generally will be sympathetic to these intuitions. They may share some of this suspicion that Jack has. If people need a refresher, I suggest they just read those first chapters before, because it's going to be faster than re-listening to our previous episode. But of course, our previous episode will still be available on the feed. Tell your friends. The second chapter here is going to be about what you're talking about, both about the unhealthy marriage of church and state that partially responsible for creating this culture of oppression, but also, I think most importantly, about the way in which church uses sex as a weapon. And then the question that I was left with reading it multiple times is, okay, so people are degraded by this church redefinition of like weaponized sex, people are degraded by the idea that sex is degrading, but how does that help? Like, what does the church get out of this? And I think the answer to that isn't until chapter 3, which is why I was having a hard time understanding it. Chapter 2 is all about the church and sex, and chapter 3 is all about kind of like treat life as an adventure and what it would be like to be more liberated. But I think in chapter 3 is the resolution of this argument that starts in chapter 2.
Yeah, in chapter 3, just as a brief overview, I suppose, in chapter 3, it ends up being sort of the emphasis is on becoming self-reliant, instead of like the idea being that religion is somewhere where we go to seek power that we don't have, or we feel we don't have, and we end up giving over ourselves to a different power. But he emphasizes in chapter 3 that it ends up being we are the ones that actually create that power in the first place, and we can learn how to be self-reliant instead of...
Yeah, there's a great quote there that you're pointing at. The fundamental purpose of religion is to attain an identity with a power which we believe to be greater than ourselves, whose omnipotence and immortality we can share. Having achieved some sense of identity, we then feel that we can cope with the problems and attain ends with more confidence. The reliance on religion, as well as the reliance on property, can indicate a lack of self-reliance. And I marked this out just like you did, apparently. And I think this thing about self-reliance is important. In chapter 4, Jack's going to talk a lot about the value of feminist movements to achieving this kind of relation. And he'll even go as far as to say, like, the liberation of mankind from this kind of spiritual slavery is the responsibility of women. They're the only, not because they're morally obliged to do anything, but because they're the only people who can.
They're the ones who can.
Yeah. But in here, this thing about self-reliance, charity starts at home, is an important clue to what the solution to this is. If you become a person who is self-admiring, self-confident, believes in your own powers, you become less deferent to authorities. And so the value of this weapon of sex anxiety for the church is that it creates a problem that you need to go outside of yourself to solve. So, and sex, the sex instinct is universal. All creatures experience this drive to, I won't say to procreate, because that's not how we think of it. It's like a drive for pleasure and for social relation, and to be
union.
Yeah, reflected in union with another person. And so if that becomes morally unhealthy, then everyone feels that unhealthiness and will look to a doctor in a frock to try and...
Yeah, and then people start to think it is only about reproduction and that sort of thing, and that's the argument that's used, because we use clinical kind of logical processes to work things out, rather than being connected, as we will see later on in chapter 4, to some of the more subconscious level things and the more earthy kinds of things that he appeals to women to really embrace.
And this idea that sex is only for procreation, of course, I wasn't going to read this, but I will now. The sexual perversion of Christianity becomes obvious when it is realized that the Holy Ghost, Sophia, is feminine, and the very tetragrammaton Yod-He-Vav-He means father, mother, son, daughter, and asserts the splendor of the biological order. How could life proceed from a strictly masculine creation? What miracle could possibly be superior to the miracle of copulation, conception, and gestation? So this quote that we read earlier about the calumny against women, this idea of immaculate conception being somehow better than regular conception, it becomes a really big deal, because not only is sex only for procreation is best when it excludes sex. The greatest person ever was conceived without this essential piece. So anyway, here's this bit still in chapter 3 where he talks explicitly about the turning away from the self towards the divine by virtue of sex anxiety. He says, if in our folly and fear we will ascribe moral qualities to the lightning that strikes, to the stars that shine, to the tiger that kills, then we will not hesitate to assign them also to women who give and the man who takes. Thus we will define God and found a religion. As man, self-castrated, self-frustrated, flees down the corridors of nightmare, pursued by monstrous machines, overwhelmed by satanic powers, haunted by visage, guilts, and terrors, all created out of his own imagination, he escapes into an absurdity, drowns his spirit in pretense, worships brass gods of power and tin gods of success. Then, shamed by his pretenses and frustrated by his self-denial, he projects his horror on imagined enemies, seeks release in scapegoats and false issues, thereby propitiating those bestial gods who have arisen from the shattered edelions of his spirit with sacrifices and blood. Holy smokes, that's a mouthful. One wonders how I could have possibly missed it the first time. Here's the important bit. Then, shamed by his pretenses and frustrated by his self-denial, he projects his horror onto imagined enemies, seeks release in scapegoats and false issues. Mm-hmm. This is, and so this is the sort of turning towards mythology to absolve oneself from sins which are only imaginary. So this is the mechanism of the weapon of the church that clamps down and takes hold on a whole population, and becomes very, very productive in Jack's view. So Jack will talk about how some of the consequences of this are. He'll not only want to say that this is a source of anxiety for people, but it's bad for society generally. He'll say that STIs and abortionists are the result of this dim view, because people don't have proper sex education, and so people are embarrassed by sexual diseases, so they don't seek treatment maybe, and then they spread the sexual diseases, or they're embarrassed by pregnancies which occur out of wedlock, and so they need to terminate those pregnancies. Abortion is there's a dim view of it in Thelema because it interferes with the will of a soul to incarnate in the body they've chosen. There's problems with this too. I think that it's more complicated than just one shouldn't have abortions.
And I wonder if this is like in the context of this in 1950 or 1946, as the case may be. He may have been writing in a world where maybe abortion was not, it was kind of done under the radar in kind of clandestine circumstances rather than being legal. It may have been illegal and performed in trickier circumstances as a result. Maybe that's part of what this also refers to, because it sounds like that's what we're talking about with the STI thing, where it's because people are pretending like they've never had sex before marriage, and they maybe even pretend like they don't have sex except maybe that one time with like a sheet between and all that sort of thing in order to procreate. Then maybe that it's a dishonesty with the self that leads to illegal actions needing to be taken, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Do think we can acknowledge that there are things that exist in Thelema that we may not agree with.
No,
personally.
you're absolutely right. You are absolutely right, and I don't deny
that.
Crowley was against abortion.
Yeah.
And obviously nowadays there's fierce debate over the subject, and I think a lot of people who identify with Thelema or are interested in Thelema are pro-abortion, and it's a difficult subject.
Well, Crowley's against abortion because of this thing about souls choosing to incarnate and interfering with the will of other beings, but there are also there's at least one secret paper you can read about how to breed an elemental, and what you do is you take a woman and you sort of expose her to elemental symbols. Like if you're trying to do Venus, you put her in a green room and you make everything out of brass, and you sort of have to torture her for 9 months by putting her in these very strange circumstances. And what it does is it inspires the elemental spirit to inhabit the body of the gestating fetus. Thus, one imagines driving away the soul that was planning to incarnate in that body. So interfering in the same way as abortion does with the will of another person.
Well, not in the same way, but in a comparable way.
Yes. So it's not. But the important thing is that if the problem with abortion is that it stops a soul from incarnating, whether
this sounds
whether or not this practice is endorsed, it's at least described and without, and not said like, oh, you should never ever do this. And then also Crowley talks about in the Blue Equinox quite openly about using prophet houses as places to for pregnant women to reside, and then the prophet house can adopt your baby if because there's an acknowledgement that unwanted pregnancy is a problem, that parenting against your will, like surprise parenting, is a massive impediment to life process. It really, really changes the direction of your existence. And so if you don't want to do that, then Crowley's offering you a solution that he thinks at least is a real solution, which is something that the pro-life people do not do, I don't think. I myself think abortions are great and people should have more of them. Population problem is a real problem as far as I'm concerned. But the thing is, when it comes to niggly little issues like this, like the question of, should people or should people not get abortions, or questions like who's allowed to get married and who isn't, it seems so up to individual decision, right? Like Thelemites can tell other Thelemites why in Thelema abortion is unhealthy, but why is thought of as unhealthy, but why would a secular political leader tell an entire population? It's a
unless of course they were appealing to a large swath of that population for votes.
Yeah, like maybe, but I think this is better. I think what Jack says about making people anxious and deferent and desperate, just for the sake of making them feel bad. Like this question of sex anxiety is something that affects everyone.
Yeah.
And so if we can make strict rules around sex, then people feel defeated and are much less likely to express themselves as individuals, and we don't have to deal with a healthy population. We can deal with a repressed lump-in sort of population, which is something we already know the tools how to deal with. Not that you couldn't have a government that ruled over free, confident people, but those tools would need to be developed. All the existing tools are for ruling over depressed masses, and so these things, the reason to make legislation that is like pro-abortion is to get a bunch of populist votes, to be seen as the good guy, and the reason to oppress abortion is to distress and torture the population. There might be real reasons to do both of those things that are morally justifiable, but I don't think governments make decisions based on values. I think they make decisions on political expediency, and I think Jack's right.
If values ever come into it, they eventually go out the door in favor of expediency and convenience and whatnot.
It's been so helpful to get that in this thing about imagined demons, because it's always been a question for me about how these things become issues. Like, somebody might hate abortions, but that's a conversation they can have with their spouse. Mm-hmm. Why does it become a public conversation? This is why.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's kind of worth mentioning as well, this also gives us a chance to address the overarching theme of the paper as well, which is that these institutions and governments and approaches to things have been around. They're as old as time, practically. Mm-hmm. They go way back into our past as human beings. And the alternative, being freedom, has only been around for a couple hundred years or so. So he's looking at it as being these things are still, these old ways are still reaching to us and restricting us and oppressing us from the Middle Ages. And the freedom thing is still in its birth pangs in a lot of ways. So it's still we haven't struck out and actually created real freedom per se. He addresses later on the various personages between the Middle Ages and ourselves who have essentially tried to dismantle the old ways and define a new way, but it hadn't taken.
That's right. Here's just a couple more quotes around this, which I think flesh it out a little bit, although I think we've done a good job. As I mentioned above, sublimated sex has been the source of power for the Christian Church. Sex and sex neurosis are fundamental factors in the attitude of modern man, and these three facts give sex a place of prime importance in our liberal examination of society. And then a little further down the page, the enjoyment of a natural urge is defined as a crime. Young persons thus enjoying the urge in the wonder of the beginning are burdened with a sense of guilt and shame. They are classed with common criminals. And then further along, what's the consequence of this, of making young people who are, just learning about their bodies and everything else, what's the consequence of saddling them with this kind of shame? In this childish folly of sexual possession, each man and each woman hates and fears every other man and woman as a potential despoiler or some joke by the ever-present spectators of jealousy and suspicion. So the population not only becomes homogenous in its anxiety, but people become isolated by being suspicious of everyone around them, and the feeling of there's something about becoming a homogenous mass that makes you even more afraid to express yourself honestly. It's like you're ashamed, so you need the support of the crowd, and then crowds are powerful because they can work together. But individuals in that crowd are unable to express anything that's dissenting because they're, or not even dissenting, but unique, because they're so afraid of being judged either positively or negatively by their fellows.
Yeah, and then just one thing that you excluded from that was it is possible that the application of two old axioms, that you love one another and that you do unto others as you would have others do unto you, might go a long way in helping us solve our sexual problems. The application of these maxims in a sexual relations is easy and pleasant. If firmly established, the principles might spread to other areas of human intercourse. I think that's worth noting as well, because is it exactly what you're talking about. Like when you become an individual within a crowd, even if initially you're kind of bought into that crowd, your individuality has to be repressed to be part of that crowd at some point. But if we learn to actually express love in the way that he's talking about with that final thought, then we could actually appreciate each other's uniqueness instead of having to treat it like some kind of threat.
People can think this is true or not true, but you're right. In here, there's the idea that homogeny and the kind of community we have now is actually based on mutual suspicion, whereas individuality the consequence of individuality would be a greater mutual respect and cooperation. It's almost a callback to what we saw in the Tao Te Ching, where to achieve one thing, you pursue the opposite. Rather than pursuing community by denying individuality and kowtowing to everyone else in the community, you become an individual who can then work with other individuals. The rest of this chapter has a lot of recommendations for how to overhaul sex. And I was saying last time that I thought things were not better now, and you kind of gave me like low-key heck about that, because, we're not, we don't have sodomy laws and divorce, although not easy in Canada,
it's certainly more frequent.
Is certainly more common,
and more acceptable socially. Because I mean, you could be a pariah within your own family back in the day. So I wouldn't say that it's better. I would say that it's different. And I think that's the difficulty with that kind of thing, is that it's, you feel like you have to say, well, is it better or worse? Or is it somewhere in between? And it's like, it's a little more gradient than that, I think.
Well, if it's not better, then it's interesting that a lot of Parsons' recommendations have been taken. This thing about, trying not to shame your children over their sexuality, this thing of, we know that divorce is bad, but loveless homes are worse, and so divorce laws should be loosened up, relax pornography laws, and all these things have been done. So if it's not better, then the question is that because there's been covert attempts to end around the relaxation of these strictures? Is it because Parsons is wrong in his diagnosis and recommendations? Or is it because tweaking the mechanism doesn't actually cure the underlying anxiety, and people still internally live in the old world despite interacting in a new one?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that probably there's still an instinct towards exactly. I like the way that you put that, with the idea that becoming part of the crowd essentially is like based on, I forget exactly the wording you used for that, but the suspicion, it's based on suspicion. It's not based on actually love and respect per se. It's actually more based on suspicion.
Well, here Parsons says, in this childish folly of sexual possession, each man and woman hates and fears every other man and woman.
And I think that's something that comes underneath the surface. What initially becoming part of the group, it's often because you hate and are suspicious of those outside of the group or those that are seen as being in opposition to the group. And then once you're in the group, any sense of individuality must be suppressed in order to maintain your position within that group. So there's inevitably going to be some suspicion and hatred that comes out of that. But I feel like that's still ever present, and I think that's going to be an ongoing thing to heal and redirect in humanity, because it's just so natural for us to fall into those things. You want to be part of the crowd, or if you don't want to be part of the crowd, you want to be safe. Mm-hmm. And you want to feel like you're part of the right. You want to feel like you're on the side of the right. Like people will say, I don't want to end up being on the wrong side of history. And it's like, I mean, you could examine what that actually means and everything like that as well. But
it's very difficult to know how far into the future to project.
Yeah, and
it's like, I don't
how things are actually going to be seen.
I don't want to be in the wrong. I don't want to be in the wrong side of history tomorrow, in 10 years, in 100 years. And the further into the future you want to preserve your reputation, the more murky it becomes, as you're saying. So people do just kind of live inside that Overton window. And when it's moving as quickly as it is now, that is a source of anxiety for a lot of people. But yes, so this moves us very nicely. It's almost as if some conscious entity were crafting the course of our conversation. Jack Parsons. This moves us very nicely into chapter 3, which is all about this adventure of living and living life as an adventure. What do you want to say about it?
So in chapter 3, I feel like Parsons, maybe we can compare notes for this, but basically Parsons is describing how religion gives us the impression that human beings are like God's little children, and we have this feeling that we're special and that we have a special place in the universe and that sort of thing. And he's kind of dismantling that and saying there's not actually any reason to think of ourselves as anything other than just beasts from the wild who have suddenly become aware of ourselves and have begun to actually redirect our energies into the things that we think are productive. And as a result of this, there's no real reason to think that we're naturally wise and naturally kind and naturally all these things that religion would have us believe, but that there is a lot of proof to the contrary that we are quite savage creatures. And I think we're probably capable of both things. But his upshot to this is going to be that it is not religion that we are dependent upon, although we have traditionally been dependent upon it to give us some kind of feeling of power and some feeling of confidence, some self-confidence. Instead, that power and self-confidence was always within us to begin with. And he's encouraging us to seek out that self-reliance that is kind of our birthright, so to speak, and that we can pursue instead of religion, which becomes a system of dependence, as previously described.
It's a bit of a weird way of parsing it, because in the first paragraph of chapter 3, he'll say, there's no reason to believe that he is naturally good and kind, meaning like human beings. There is much evidence that he is by nature cruel, cowardly, lustful, avarice, and treacherous. He stopped short, I think, of saying evil. I'm just scanning through it now. But we think of good as contrasted against evil or against bad. Like if you want to do good and bad, like having good things is good and not having good things is bad.
And he'll go on to define good and evil by his terms.
Yeah, so it is weird to start by saying that like there's no evidence that people are good, there's plenty of evidence that people are bad, and then later on say, well, good and evil are only about useful and unuseful.
I feel like it's a strategic avoidance of using those terms here, though, because we have those associations with those things. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, if we look at Nietzsche, for instance, the idea that if we were strong, we would just take what we want. If we are intellectual, it's because we are not strong enough to take what we want. So we use our intellect to be clever and find our way to getting what we want by cunning. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I would argue that that's still getting what you want. You
right.
know? So in this case, it's like, yeah, we're cruel, we're cowardly, we're lustful, we're avaricious, we're treacherous. Those are ways that people have traditionally gotten what they want. And you can't really deny it looking at history.
I think it's difficult to lump cowardice in there. I think even the treacherous have to have a certain amount of courage in their treachery.
Yeah, but I think cowardice is aptly put in there. Just, I mean, in this case, it's emphasizing the fact that we're just not naturally courageous, as we like to think of ourselves, by the point that he's getting at. But not only that, I would also argue that cowardice can keep you alive, where being brave can cause you to sacrifice yourself.
Right. Strategic courage rather than just fighting every lion that comes out of the wilderness.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I mean, I think the import of this is that people are not, that these kinds of religious values of charity and self-sacrifice and chastity as defined by, it's different at Thelema, but chastity as defined by the Christian church. These things are not inherent virtues of man. So if you fail in them, you're not unique in failing to live up to your, to quote unquote, live up to your birthright. There is no birthright, and in fact, there is no failure because what's natural is actually something else. And so he kind of begins with the antidote trying to give an antidote to the sex anxiety that we've seen before. But it almost sounds like he's saying people aren't special. Like there's no evidence that we're, God's vice-regents upon the earth. But then he goes on to say, in what way we are special by virtue of...
We create what is special.
By virtue of our ability to... The fact that we've kind of fallen ass backwards by evolution into reason and science, and that we can do reason and that we have science. Never mind that earlier in the paper he's carrying a torch for anti-rationalism and trying to throw the positivists under the bus as being artificial scientists. Reason can't explain everything. But now he says the only thing special about people is that we can do reason.
Well, there's a line in there where he says that where we don't find reason or meaning to things, we create it.
Yeah. To what extent is that the problem of of religion? Being pointed back at.
Yeah, I don't know that it's necessarily a problem. It's something we naturally do that he's referring to, whether we're creating religion by making meaning by creating religion or otherwise.
Now, what does this mean for us? Because we're going to go on to talk about the value of life as an adventure, the value of freedom, the value of self-discovery. But I admit that I sort of glossed this chapter because, being the most thelemic of the 4 chapters, it seemed to me the least important, which I know sounds weird, but I thought that the Thelema stuff was dealt with better in other places. Although there's nothing wrong with this, it's good. But what's the structure of this? How do we get from this idea of like man is the uniquely rational animal, and good and evil are just
relative terms?
Yeah. How do we get from this idea of man as a rational animal to good and evil are relativistic ideas to this idea of discovering your own individuality and the adventure of that? What's the structure here?
Well, I mean, if I can be allowed to infer, it seems to me that he's pointing out that just by what I was saying with the concept of I'll just read the quote. If there is no other reason and no other significance, man himself has on occasion created reason and significance, standing as the maker of his gods in a garden made fruitful by his own creative power. And as I say, if I can be allowed to infer, I think what he gets at here is he's pointing out the fact that we've created these religions and these gods, and therefore we can recreate things in our own image. So we don't have to rely on the old ways. We can recreate things in a more honest and authentic way, where we can really become true to ourselves and present with those things that we tried to repress in past centuries. And thereby, we can find true self-reliance, and this will channel our real creative energies. So this goes back to the individuality thing, being true to yourself and not repressing and restricting yourself in order to be part of a crowd, and being able to find proper expression for those things.
This is he. Some of this seems to be a little bit more inspired, because there are places where he's marking out a rational argument in plain language, and places where he gets quite carried away in the loveliness of the poetry. And I think it's to his virtue that he lets himself do this. But all nature partakes of the eternal sacraments of life and death, ebb and flow, of creation and destruction, regeneration. These are the harmonies of eternity that change forever and never change. The cry of the baby is echoed in the tumult of the nova. Men's suns and seasons pass and return again. The spate of seamen is one with the jet of the stars that men call the Milky Way. And so I've answered my own question by actually just reading the entire paragraph. But I was thinking that there's some mystical association being drawn here, between the human course of life and the human orgasm, and then the creative power of the cosmos. It does seem to me that there's something special about man, even though he just said there wasn't. But of course, it begins with all nature partakes of the eternal sacraments of life.
Yeah, I think this is where when I was originally going over this for our first talk, I was thinking of it. It seems to me that this is where he's really introducing the idea of both mysticism and magic, but not in those specific words. He's kind of alluding to them. So he's in the passages that you've marked out here. It's pointing out the correspondence and connection between things. So this is like mysticism in the sense of recognizing your oneness with the entire universe. But it's also magic because of the fact that you're going to be working with all those other things and engaging with all those other things.
And he's going to go on through here. We are one with Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Shakespeare, of one blood with Moses, Lao Tzu, and Newton. It's a weird three. Well, Newton's an alchemist, so maybe the other two are alchemists. Maybe that's why they get lumped together. But the idea here is that when he talks about reason and science, he thinks of humanity and this kind of artistic inspiration. Like if science and reason are what has explanatory force, then all these beauties and arts and inspirations have to be part of reason and science, maybe. And so that when he says the only thing special about people is reason and science, he's using that broadly to mean that this includes our ability to create lots of different types of stuff.
He gets once he gets into the idea of art and science, they seem to be the twin things which give us real expression, because science is knowledge and art is expression. It's being able to take the knowledge of things and your understanding of things and actually find expression for things. So it's the creative side of it.
Mm-hmm. There's this here. The voice of the wind, the poignancy of music, the shout of thunder, all cry out to man, daring him to know himself. Sunlight, sea, and stars, and the splendor of a naked woman are the signs and witnesses of a covenant that is forever. We know these things. We know them with the only certainty that is ever given us. So the ability to regard beauty is some part of this too, to be involved actively as a participant in our lives, and these things that are primal and inspiring and natural and real. These are the things that give us the sort of magical inspiration to create poetry and to have spiritual experiences like Shakespeare and Lao Tzu.
And it seems to be the way that he's trying to balance things as against the positivists, where it's just purely empirical. So he does believe in science, he does believe in the rational mind, combined with that more visceral level of things.
Is it important that these are all things which require a certain amount of courage, maybe? I mean, the voice of the wind, the poignancy of music, the shout of thunder, the daring to know himself. The first three things are sort of like things that can be regarded and enjoyed, but then the fourth thing in that sentence is daring to know himself, to interrogate internally, which I actually do think takes courage. Mm-hmm. Sunlight, sea and stars, and the splendor of the naked woman are the signs and witnesses of a covenant forever. There's something about the first three again being like frontiers, mm-hmm. and understanding sort of like the bigness of something being confronted, and then the splendor of the naked woman is like, I mean, we've talked about sex anxiety for an hour and a quarter. There's something about the danger implied by the libidinal instinct. Is it important? I think it might be important that these are all like things that you need courage mm-hmm. to address.
And it almost seems like those are the results of the courage of engaging with the universe. You have the resultant appreciation and full union with the beauty of the universe thereby. And
now he's going to bring it back to the political level, thinking that he's sort of proved his point about the life of adventure and the courage to interrogate the self. Maybe he doesn't have to prove his point. He just has to inspire us to make us think that this sounds like fun, which is why it becomes so poetic there for a few minutes. There's like a sexiness and a sense of enthusiasm that might come through in that poetic
Yeah, and
language.
I mean, I guess if he's going to be arguing against just pure rationalizing of things, then he can't just use a purely rational argument for it. So he has to go off on some kind of a tangent to some extent.
Paragraph 13 of this third section. We are now in the midst of a tremendous battle of forces contending for dominion over the mind and spirit of man. It is not, unfortunately, a battle between good and evil, between freedom and tyranny, but rather the struggle of dogma against dogma and authority versus authority. The contenders are fascism and communism. Each is a doctrine alien and hostile to the ideal of freedom. Each says we must choose between one or the other, and each in reality is identical. Each demands the absolute enslavement of the individual and the abnegation of the intellect and the subjugation of the will. It's weird, isn't it, how the leftists continue to accuse the rightists of fascism, and the rightists who have always accused the leftists of communism are actually now maybe starting to accuse the leftists of fascism too.
Yeah, so going back to what we were saying earlier, it does seem like this has not changed. It's just changed in terms of the verbiage that's used.
Yeah, there's a question of how much better things have gotten. Mm-hmm. I think we still get stuck with a lot of groupthink and partisanship that makes everybody, really stupid. That you vote for one guy just to get rid of the other guy, and you can't interrogate anybody's values because even though, so I'm going to vote for X just to get rid of the other guy, but I can still disagree with X on certain points. But if I disagree with X on certain points, it's going to make other people suspicious of X and less likely to vote for him, and that weakens my chances of getting rid of the other guy. So we lose the ability to interrogate our own figureheads and can only punch across the aisle. And this is sort of problematic and creates the kind of same mass consciousness that the religious anxiety does.
So the idea of freedom and its interconnection, or its firm connection with the idea of individuality and the expression of the individual is something that still hasn't found a real solid liveliness in day-to-day life yet.
It's no longer explicit Stalinists fighting explicit Nazis. So, like, I think that's better.
Yeah.
I do think that that the political movements we have now are on both sides of the aisle healthier than the political movements that Parsons is talking about, but they're still unhealthy in their homogeny. I think.
There's still a tendency towards the exact same thing that he's talking about with the struggle of dogma against dogma, authority versus authority.
This is cool, which I'm not reading for any reason other than that I think it's interesting. Come unto me, goes the old harlot's song. Come unto me, you weary, heavily laden. Surrender your intolerable burden of freedom, and I will fill your mouths with miracles and your bellies with food. Come with me, I will confound your enemies and show you paradise. Look, you do not even have to change a name, only keep the letter and deny the spirit, for the letter giveth life. She is harvesting the nations now, that old whore, for an appointment in a place called Armageddon. Harvesting the nations, he means in Revelation where the Grim Reaper, who, by the way, is Jesus, reaps the harvest of the earth and puts all the blood of the saints into the winepress. And then when he means talking about the old whore and she, the old harlot, he means Babylon.
Now, I would argue that, it's Babylon in the Book of Revelations, but he does come back to Babylon later on as a freeing force, whereas I think this is, in a sly way, saying that this is like the illusion of these things preferred by what he's referring to as the fascism and the communism.
Yeah, well, so this is what I like about it, is because it's weird for a Thelemite to do this in this way, because for us, these symbols are very, very sacred. Mm-hmm. And you're right, he goes back to the sacredness he's later on.
Them at the moment.
But for here, he says, harvesting the nations rather than harvesting the earth. And in the Book of Revelation, after the passage that talks about Babylon, the mystery of Babylon is explained, and it says, okay, so the woman is a city, and the when they say Babylon the Great has fallen, they don't mean the woman, they mean the nation. Mm. And so for him to say harvesting the nations is cool. So the harlot that comes for us is not the whore of Babylon riding upon the beast. It's political partisanship, mm-hmm. And the literal nation for which that symbol used to be a euphemism for national corruption and distance from God, ironically. And now he's using it to mean national corruption in terms of like the church and state being two in bed together. Mm-hmm. That's all the quotations I had from that chapter. Did you have anything else you wanted to do?
Yeah, let me just double check here real quick. I mean, we have he's establishing his ideas of good and evil. Mm-hmm. That's probably worth touching on briefly.
Well, we talked about it a little bit, but sure, if you want to read the quote, I think it's a good quote. Yeah, just to read the quote
directly, because I think it's worthwhile for one or two things. Nothing is of its nature evil, and nothing is of its nature good. Evil is only excess. Good is simple balance. And I think that's kind of an interesting way of parsing it, and I'm not sure that I totally would, that it all comes together or whatnot, but all things are subject to abuse and likewise susceptible to beneficial use. Balance does not consist in denial or excess in indulgence. So balance does not consist in denial, which balance being good. Denial does not produce balance necessarily. Excess is not produced specifically from indulgence. Balance can only be obtained by exceeding. And he uses the term exceeding, going back to excess. So I think it's like, is he doing that because he's trying to show that what he's defining as evil, being excess, is necessary to achieving balance?
So he's not being that strict with his etymology here, and it's because he wants to reference the Book of the Law. When he says exceeding, he means he's referring to chapter 1 of the Book of the Law, and I can't pull any quotes off the top of my head, but
exceed.
Be strong, O man, thus can thou bear more joy is kind of the idea. There's also something that says like exceed by delicacy or something like this. Mm-hmm. So he's going to Crowley here, and I think it might be Book 1, Velmegi, where it talks about the importance of balance. Also, one of our duties is to develop in due harmony all the faculties which we possess. Mm-hmm. So we don't restrict one in order to balance it with the others. We develop all in due proportion. But Crowley was going to some Golden Dawn teaching that was to do, and is mirrored in our holy books as well, that was to do with unbalanced mercy is but weakness that would allow evil to occur, and unbalanced severity is but tyranny. Mm-hmm. And then, but also Crowley's going to Nietzsche, who has these two definitions of good and bad versus good and evil. And the idea of evil is a way for underclasses to get revenge against people who have a lot of goods.
Yeah, and the way that Parsons is describing balance is further fleshed out in the following statement. The elemental forces in man's nature are so tremendous that they can only be balanced by an ultimate self-expression. To place limitations and restrictions on this nature is to build a wall of plaster around a sun. So I think, he is getting at the idea that balance meaning full expression. So not just restricting certain things and then promoting certain things, which is an unbalance. So.
There's a way people talk about emotions as being positive and negative. Mm-hmm. And I've even heard smart people say like negative emotions like anger and which tend toward violence or something. And people will say, doing pop psychology, if like they'll talk about honoring their feelings, like just acknowledge this is how you feel now and move through it. But it doesn't include the idea of expression. The idea of honoring is sort of just like passive acknowledgement and then wait till it goes away on its own. Yeah. And he's going to say, I think you're going to talk to Edward Mason about anger the next time you speak. And that will be an interesting conversation because in reference to this, because what he means is you don't achieve balance by restricting. You achieve balance by full expression of all of your faculties. Yeah,
there's nothing wrong with anger. That is just something that you're going to be feeling, and by treating it as something that's wrong, that's where, anytime you're repressing something, it's not just going to go away.
I don't think it's true that I've never regretted anything I've said in anger, but I think I've rarely regretted anything I've said in anger, and I've often regretted times when I got really mad and didn't say anything.
Well, man, I've regretted things that I've said when I was really excited and happy. Yeah. It's like, I think it's like there's potential in anything.
I think that's worse for me, is when I get carried away by enthusiasm. People get way more trampled under by my just readiness to be there than they do by my anger, which, like everyone else in our culture, I repress to an unhealthy degree. So that it's really my joyful moments of like, oh man, it'll be so funny if I say this, where I've hurt way more people's feelings doing that than just like honestly telling them to fuck off because they were being abusive.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think in terms of potentialities. Like, okay, you feel anger. That has potentialities. It's the way that it finds expression that can be destructive or useful to you. But it needs to find expression. That's just part and parcel of it. Any of these feelings need to find expression, and if you're repressing them, I hope you're doing it for a particular goal, because you may be able to find some way to channel it if you're doing it properly, but otherwise it's going to find its own expression in some way. So again, I think like the whole idea of him touching on the subject of good and evil is to deconstruct it from the old ways of our tendencies of seeing it. As you mentioned, like even intelligent, educated people will tend to think of quote-unquote negative emotions and that sort of thing. And we'll have these Judeo-Christian cultural mores that we're not even conscious of. I mean, even within the Thelemic community, we'll naturally have those still kind of, in the shadow realms of ourselves and our presumptions and preconceptions and things. And that's a gradual process to deconstruct those things, but it's an important process.
Nietzsche's going to say that Christianity is explicitly a conspiracy against the Roman aristocracy to, destroy the middle class by virtue of like replacing them all with slaves. And the way you do this is by making charity the primary virtue, so that people who have lots of things feel bad about having them, and people who don't have things are morally right just by virtue of their poverty. Mm-hmm. And so over the course of several generations, you have this class flip where people who live this virtue of charity by virtue of like having to, because if they don't support each other, they'll starve to death, become the dominant class over the people who have the natural virtue of having things. And this is Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity, and Crowley in a way follows this to a degree, but he has his own thoughts as well. And so another thing that Jack might mean when he says we don't balance by restricting is that like a maximum wage is not an answer, or like if some people have gifts, we don't get equality by restricting gifted people and preventing them from expressing what's natural, or by artificially giving more room to people who are less gifted or something. Everybody has to be given the room to exceed in their own areas.
Yeah, I guess you could sort of see it as like, for instance, with if you were taking the path of the AA system, or just with Thelema in general, there is, as we've talked about before, there's an emphasis on the fact that the rational mind needs to be kind of worked past. You have to go beyond it. But there's a lot of work, especially in the early stages, developing the rational mind and the intellect and that sort of thing. So it's not that we would want to repress that side and concentrate on other areas. It's that we would want to flourish that area to its fullest, as well as flourishing our weaker areas. So we're exceeding in that sense. I suppose that's one way to look at that.
That's right. This thing that Kant does, where he explores the limits of reason, the critique of pure reason, right? The limits of what the rational can do. Mm-hmm. A mutual friend of ours used to say, you don't transcend the game of tennis without playing it. Mm-hmm. You actually have to know what all these rules of logic are before you can understand what you can and can't do with them. Trans-rationalism or post-rationalism or like post-enlightenment thinking is not the same as anti-rationalism.
Mm-hmm. It's an important distinction.
Yeah.
In anything that you're developing, you want to be able to imprint the rules into yourself so that you don't have to think of them, and that way, then you're ready to transcend them.
Why are women the special solution to this problem?
Well, this is where we're going to be moving on to chapter 4, where he does appeal to women directly. And that's where our emphasis goes. Now, are you looking at something just before we move on to that, or is that
No,
what you're
no.
getting at?
I'm sort of trying to set us up to move on to the next place.
Yeah, and this starts to feel like the goal of this entire paper is to set up this whole appeal to women and heralding Babylon, the coming of Babylon.
That's right. We're in a bad place, and we're in a bad place because we have sex anxiety, and it would be better if life were an adventure and people were individuals. And in order to become individuals, we need the help from the
not only that,
the
but
beautiful redeemer of the race.
Yeah, throughout this paper, he's emphasized the fact that the old times, all these things that he's complaining about with the church and all this sort of thing is because it's been up to men, and they've been repressing women and making women feel ashamed of their natural abilities and whatnot. So the answer going forward is not to continue with this folly, of course. It's also not to repress or restrict the strengths of men in favor of a matriarchy where women become the ones who are in power. It's about balance. So again, what he's describing as this good, it's exceeding with both sides of the coin that he's defining here and putting things into an equality going forward.
There's a couple things going on simultaneously. There's just saying that women are the special solution to this problem. There's an attempt to explain what that solution is, how women are employed, if you like, to solve this problem. And then at the same time, there's this kind of two-pronged approach to enlisting women to solve this problem. And the two prongs are sort of a flattery that says, like, I, Jack Parsons, understand your position. And then sort of an imprecation or something like, I know this is a lot of work, but it'll be better for everyone if you take it on. So please, 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 don't do the Nietzschean revenge thing. Forgive men and then help them get better at stuff.
There is a real feeling here that he does actually have a strong appreciation for women and what they have that we and himself do not have, the strengths that they have and the things that they bring to the table. There's also a sense that I think in our first discussion, I had set things up by giving a really brief kind of reference to Jack Parsons' life and times and all that sort of thing. And one of the things that was obviously very important to him was the fact that he at one point invoked Babylon in the desert, and then he was trying to bring her forth in the flesh, and he believed that he did so in the form of Marjorie Cameron. So there's obviously like a very important aspect of that for him. He also channeled what he believed to be the fourth chapter of the Book of the Law, which was the chapter of Babylon. And so it's clearly this is an important thing that's kind of in the background of his mind as he's writing this.
Somewhere in the world today there is a woman for whom the sword is forged, and somewhere there is one who has heard the trumpets of the new age and who will respond. I just, from context, I assumed he hadn't met Cameron yet. I think that
either
someone that he's going to say that this is later on. He's going to think of this as being maybe prophetic, that he predicted he would meet Cameron.
It may also be alluding to like a magical child that he had helped bring forth. So that's a possibility as well. I think there was something to that effect as well, where he felt like there would be somewhere out there there'd be somebody born who was that person. So
this is the start of this is so sort of strange to me. Maybe because I'm not a woman, although I'm also not a gender essentialist, so I don't assume that all women have had the same type of experience. But let's begin at the beginning. It is to you, O woman, beautiful redeemer of the race, whom I address this chapter. That which stirs in you now is not madness, not sin, not folly, but life. The new life is the joy and the fire that will beget a new race, create a new heaven and a new earth. When you were a child, did not the wind and sun speak to you? Did you not hear the mountain's voice, the voice of the river and of the storm? Have you not heard the whisper of the stars and the ineffable voice in silence? Have you not gone naked in the forest with the wind on your body and felt the caresses of Pan? Your heart has swollen with the spring, blossomed with the summer, and saddened with the winter. These things are the covenant, and in them is the truth that is forever. You've only sort of, as we're recording this, only sort of put out one of these so far, another one to come tomorrow. If this show ends up having any kind of an audience, I would love for the women in the audience to kind of let us know whether they did, in fact, hear the wind and sun speak to them, hear the mountain's voice, the voice of the river and the storm. Like, I don't assume that I know what that means. It seems to be sort of fundamental to what is going to happen next. So, yeah, we're getting Jack's perspective and his belief that he really understands. His argument hinges on his ability to get a sympathy from his audience and say, like, you women know that you are priestesses. This is an essential part of your character, to be connected to the spirit of nature and to be able to speak with the true voice of natural phenomena, and that if anyone's going to be able to preach the spiritual truth, it's going to be the women who are, by their essence, connected to it. And if you don't feel connected to it now, surely you remember a time when you were, before misogynist culture took that faculty away from you, and you can recover it by running naked through the forests. And if you have body shame, don't worry, because running naked through the forest is great exercise. Your body, think you'll be beautiful later. This is, and he really, it's his complete hope that this will hit people where they live and inspire them to participate in this project. And so, and I just, it doesn't seem, I miss the truthiness of it.
Yeah, it does seem like he's really worked himself up into a sort of attempt at poetry to some extent here.
It's nice. Like, I do like it.
And there is something about it that does make me think that he realizes that it's like he can't speak for women. They need to stand up and they need to be able to speak for themselves, and they need to be able to take action on their own behalf without having to be dependent on men to be providing all of that for them. But clearly men have to be able to do what they can as well in order to facilitate this kind of a situation. But inevitably he is doing the man thing of kind of defining what the situation is.
Defining what the role is, for sure, because if the woman becomes the leader of the church, then it leaves man to become, to remain the leader of the state, or that man, there's again, I haven't marked out these quotations as thoroughly as I've marked them out in other places, but he does talk about the roles being particular, that men serve this rational scientific function, and then women speak for the zeitgeist or the spirit, the world spirit, or something. And he's really kind of on his knees, saying, please, please, please come and fulfill this function again. And, even if the women do come to his call and fulfill his function, it's unclear to me that in 1946 or whatever it is, that they will be really heard in large numbers. I think in the late part of the 19th century, things were going better with the spirit knocking and all this stuff. But when all that stuff was debunked, it maybe became harder in the 40s and 50s for women to have the courage to come forward and do this job, because it seems like an especially oppressive time.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like looking at this in these terms, we as going back to Nietzsche again, it's like we dealt with a transvaluation of values in the early Christian world, where they were turning things on their heads, and you had to the point where women in Roman families and whatnot were becoming Christians and completely dedicating themselves to even just chastity, and that became a real problem because they started worrying about population, not being able to maintain population, and that sort of thing. So it was literally turning the world on its head in those times. And now that's a big part of the problem that he's trying to allude to, I think, is that we need a new transvaluation of values, which we have been seeing since Voltaire and since the birth of freedom in his estimation. And it's kind of not really been working out totally over those couple of 100 years, and it still needs a lot of work to be done, and it really does mean a transvaluation of values. So changing the way that we are predisposed to think about things and to interact with things. So like for women to be able to take this active role that he's talking about, take this fully, it means changing the world that as it has been structured towards the success of men and the way that men work. We would need to completely change that, transvalue these values that the world is based on, and it's going to be, it's not like something that's going to be able to happen overnight.
I think that feminism in this period, I mean, he says somewhere like, you guys aren't crazy, you're expressing something true, and by you aren't crazy, I think he means feminism. I think he's pointing to a popular movement that's taking place. But I think feminism in this period is really about saying that women have just as many sort of quote-unquote male virtues as men do, because, men have gone to world war at least once, and 46. They've gone to World War twice, and so women have had to take domestic jobs, factory positions, labor positions, in important jobs in industry that men sort of, again, I'll do scare quotes, should be doing, but of course all the young men folk who might take entry-level jobs are now overseas. And then both times returning from war, men have wanted their jobs back, but the women have been doing them just as well. And never mind all the people that have grown up while a generation's away at war. So the hyper saturated workplace, not only returning soldiers wanting jobs, maturing young men wanting jobs, women already in those jobs. So this is where you have things like the high school movement that say like, oh, please just stay children for another 5 years while we work this out. Everyone should be educated. I know, everyone should be educated. That's a great idea. And so, but the power of the feminist movement in this period is of saying like, no, women can drive, women can do math, women can lift things, women can participate in industry. You got the Rosie the Riveter figure and various things like this. So for him to go hard on gender essentialism, I think now there's room for gender essentialism. But at this time, it was maybe would have maybe been an unpopular move. Do you see any other thing in here that talks about why women are the antidote? Does the whole thing hinge on this like women as the priestly class thing, or is there another move that's made to support this?
Well, I think it's to me it's connected to the same thing he was talking about in the previous chapter, where we're not dealing with certain things, we're repressing certain things inside of ourselves, and so I think he's dealing with this difficulty of trying to eliminate this repression. Mm-hmm. So I think he sees, I get the impression that he sees men as exemplary of the intellectual side of things, and women as exemplary of the more subconscious and feel space kind of aspect of things, and together they represent a whole unit rather than where we're expecting everybody to just live in this. And this is why I think he has problems with positivists, for instance, because they are cutting out massive swaths of the universe just by virtue of looking at things purely empirically.
Here's the quotation I was looking for, which I think is the part that supports what you're saying now. The woman is the priestess, the guardian of the mystery, sibyl of the unconscious, and prophetess of dreams. She stands co-equal with her mate, who is the chieftain, the hunter, the thinker, and the doer. Together they balanced each other until the catastrophe of the patriarchal age, archetypified by the monosexual monster Jehovah. So, yeah, this idea, I think, is a problematic one. Her mate, the chieftain, hunter, thinker, and doer. Hunter, fine, maybe...
Artemis was a hunter.
Artemis was the hunter, but if you want to talk about like jobs, that's in one way problematic because people tend to want to see gender equity in all areas. Let's have more women in the military, or more, and females are underrepresented in the sport of hunting or something. But that to me seems like less of a problem than this question of real political power, where he says that men are not only the chieftains, but also the thinkers and the doers. Women are incapable of thinking.
I know, there's heavy implications here. His choice of wording.
And then the women in this picture are priestesses, guardians of the mysteries, sibyls of the unconscious, and prophetesses of dreams. So it's like a female... It
almost sounds like honorary positions instead of...
No, I think he thinks they're important.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But it's like a female priesthood to... as an antidote to the male priesthood of the last 2,000 years. So an exaltation of... a way to exalt the sex instinct by putting... the symbol of the sex instinct at the
it seems like he's
picture.
fumbling awkwardly towards some kind of an idea of equality, but it's not quite crystallized.
Equality, not parity. That the value that rather than saying a woman is as valuable as a man, recognizing what he thinks a woman's value actually is, and saying that value is as important as
again part of a whole values. rather than just them being treated exactly the same way. We have two parts of an overall whole that he's envisioning.
He's also going to see women as the gatekeepers of sex that men pursue, and women sort of play goalie, and so by being better goalies, they will select better. They will select better men, and the sexual selection piece of evolution will tend to produce a more robust future generation by just excluding, degraded.
This is like a prevalent thing all through the early 20th century, this whole idea of I hardly even really want to get into it, but just the whole idea that selection and how that ends up producing a better race overall. It's just kind of
Yeah, people...
By today's standards, it's really, really obvious how prevalent this was and how transfixed people seem to be in that period of time with the idea that you could somehow control the way that the race is going to progress by selection of breeding.
My joke about this is that everyone who owns a purebred dog is a eugenicist. But the way that these, I think eugenics is probably inherently problematic. I don't think there's an application where you could really morally justify the approach. but the applications that have been tried are the worst possible of all applications. Like rather than doing selective breeding the way you would do with dogs, you just do genocide. It's not like, hey, you guys are both really smart. Maybe you should get together. Perhaps your offspring would be equally smart, and then that would be really neat. It's like, no, let's just sterilize everyone with a birth defect, and put Jews in concentration camps. Like, and based on sort of false premises, like that blonde hair is a morphogenic characteristic that will produce better people, like that blonde hair is associated with other types of fitness or something, because it's a recessive gene, and so that must be a symbol of other great genes that could also be recessive. It's like really, really bad politics, really, really bad science, really bad practice, just based on like a fundamental stupidity. I think this is better because it's not a large-scale eugenics program. It's individual women being more selective about the types of mates they take on. It's a better understanding of how sexual selection works, with individuals naturally selecting traits that they actually find more appealing. And he just thinks that women should be tougher about that and learn to use birth control, so that not that this is not something where he's finger waving at women like, you should learn to use birth control. He's saying that birth control should be legal, so that women have fewer unwanted pregnancies, and
maybe socially acceptable instead of completely shamed and whatnot.
That's right. And he thinks this will, so he thinks that having strong women will mean they select strong men, and having a little bit more sexual autonomy in terms of being able to be more promiscuous and use birth control and practice sex with different partners before marriage, so that they don't end up stuck with the first guy they meet, will naturally lead to a more robust second generation, because the sexual selection piece will be there. So I don't think this is a eugenics project, but I think you're right to point at eugenics projects as being sort of adjacent to this. Yeah. But I think he's really talking about appropriate Darwinian sexual selection. And I think that's it. I think it's just like women are naturally more suited to be priests, and if they're stronger priests, then they'll mate with stronger men, and then society will be more robust overall.
Yeah, and I mean, he refers back to a previous time, like the age of Isis, going by that. We touched on that in our previous discussion as well, the idea of like the Aeons and Thelema, and the age of Isis was before this dark age of Osiris that he's complaining about. And so the age of Isis, he emphasizes, was not a matriarchy, but an equality. And that's something that he wants to regain.
That's right.
And he says that every patriarchal religion is a self-contradictory monstrosity. They are dogmatic creeds that shift like straws in the wind of the intellect. Upon this shifting structure, man has failed. He knows the futility of such artificial systems, but he fights for them with all the sick fury his frustration can generate.
Yes. And so if we have a female priest who's not only more connected to nature, but importantly, much less likely to have misogynistic attitudes towards sex, then culture as a whole will be healthier in terms of the type of sex that it has, and be less controllable by false authorities. So the second half of this chapter, the attempt to sort of give some understanding to the condition of women and endorse to the degree that he can before becoming a gender essentialist. He tries to sympathize with the female condition as he finds it, Perhaps we should do just a little bit of that, just for the sake of completeness.
Just out of curiosity, what is a gender essentialist?
I mean, well, let's say, so that you believe that there's something essential that you're born with. So there's the nature versus nurture question. What are we born with versus what's nurtured into us? Mm-hmm. Obviously, we're born with some things. Obviously, some things are nurtured into us. All of feminism in the basically throughout the 20th century, hindered on this anti-essentialist argument. You know, people up to quite late believed that women were like one thing and men were like something else. And so there were types of work that were appropriate for women and types of work that were appropriate for men. And those things were not cultural. They were not about upbringing or socialization. They were essential to the birth of a woman. And there could be outliers where a woman could be born very manly or conditioned towards manliness as she matured. But really, in the greater percentage of cases, femininity really did mean one thing by its essence, and masculinity meant something else by its essence. And the progress of feminism in the 20th century meant saying, like Simone de Beauvoir, one is not born but becomes a woman. So anything that is really feminine over and above sexual reproduction is cultured into you. So if a woman can't do math, it's because there's something wrong with the way we teach math to women. If women are bad drivers, it's because they're anxious around driving because everyone thinks they're bad drivers. If women are better at child rearing, it's because they're usually thought to be unemployable and so spend most of their time doing child rearing. And so the progress of feminism during this period is to say that no, it's just that the culture is sick, and if we change the culture, then we'll generally improve the condition of women.
So is it fair to consider this feminism that we're talking about as being a form of transvaluation of values?
I think it might be an attempt to require that, to say that because if our inherent beliefs about something changes, then hopefully our approach to that thing changes. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it changes what we value, because if what it does is make women more like men, then we're still putting primacy on male virtues. We're just saying that women have them too, and that there's nothing essentially male about them.
Mm-hmm. And it does seem like, from going back to the text here, it seems like what would be needed, I guess I mentioned that already, is that it's kind of a transvaluation of some of these male, seeing some of these male traits as necessary and basing society around those male, what are seen as male traits.
If you were going to reevaluate what you value and really value child rearing, then you would say men who chose to do child rearing would not be pitied, or
or thought of
as
in an unmanly
cute,
light,
or
something like that,
or even oh wow, good for you, you're staying home with the boy, whereas this is, women can go and do work, and they can be employed, and they can draw an income, and that makes them just as valuable as men. And if women choose to stay home with the child, that's an appropriate choice as well, because somebody needs to raise the kids. But it still values work in a workplace over work in the home. And you can see that because if a man chooses to work in the home while the wife goes to the office all day, then that's seen as a weird aberration. Mm-hmm. So I don't think this is a transvaluation of values yet. I think it's something that happens at the level of metaphysics, where like in our ontology we no longer have femininity and masculinity, except as culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so Parsons wants to find a way to do feminism that really transvaluates values, that says, no, women are women. They have these classical female virtues, and maybe they aren't good in politics, but their contribution is in some ways more important than the contribution of men, because it, at least in this age, because it will alleviate this massive cultural sickness we've been suffering from. I'm just going to read paragraph 5 of this because I think it shows not his philosophical argument, but his moral argument for why women should take this on. I shall speak to you of men. Men desire 3 things in a woman: a mother greater than themselves, a wife less than themselves, and a lover equal with themselves. Against the mother they are in revolt, the wife they hold in contempt, the lover ever eludes them. And I think this is correct. You know, I'm confused about the things that he says of women. Not that I'm confused by them, but I'm sort of hostile towards them because I think they're maybe demeaning. But this way in which men regard women and the kinds of problematic that it is, I think he's right on the money there. But then he says that any negative treatment that women receive, because of this conflicted hope that men have about like, oh, I want a woman to be these 3 different things: someone equal, someone lesser, someone superior, and I have different feelings, and I want one woman to be to be all 3 of those things. And when she is the wrong thing at the wrong time, I react with violence and frustration. He says it's not because they're being abusive because they love. And I think that that's right too. Like we never hate, but that we first love. Like the hatred is a response, is humiliation and disappointment, right? So there's a love object that fails to live up to our absolutely impossible expectations for the love object, and then men react violently, and the solution is for men to change their expectations.
I mean, he's saying these are bewildered, frightened children playing games against the dark.
That's right. And we all know women love children. So they should forgive men for their incompetence and become priests so that they can teach men to not have this sick, trifold, conflicted attitude. Again, modern people might think making this a woman's job is problematic. Why doesn't a man go to therapy and work on himself? Because the only therapist available is Freud, and he's just as psychotic about sex as everyone else. So this is why maybe another reason why we need women to do the job, because the Freudians are maybe not helpful. But yes, so...
I mean, there is something to be said about the fact that, men aren't going to be able to solve this one. We do need women to be empowered and to be taking charge with their own position on things. And it's kind of hard for a man to prescribe the solution in the absence of that.
Yeah, and it's Ouroboros kind of. Yeah. It eats its own tail because... you want to say that men can't make solutions on behalf of women, so women need to step up. But how do women step up in a very misogynist culture where they're immediately disregarded? So
this is why I was mentioning that whole idea of like we need some transvaluation of values in regard to the I guess what we can describe as the patriarchal approach to things, because that needs to change in order to make the space, in order to make the ground fertile for women to be able to completely flourish.
You were saying before about how important it was to listen to women and how like, oh, it'd be nice to have some women on even, you know? And I think what we say is like, oh, a bunch of, middle-aged white guys sitting around talking about girls. Like, I don't want to listen to another one of these podcasts. I think what we say is that we're, not talking about the female condition. We're talking about the text.
Yeah.
And so if we're talking about the female condition, I think maybe the conversation is over. Unless there's something else you wanted to pull out of here.
No, I do think this is what I'm saying though is relating to the way that he's presenting the material as well. It's essentially more that I'm commenting on something within the material that does need to be addressed.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, moving on though. After this point, he goes into a little bit of a reference to history again. So throughout the paper, he's been alluding to, I guess you could say he's been alluding to the transition from the Middle Ages into the period of Voltaire and the various leaders of the U.S. government who helped to give birth to and forward the cause of freedom, which was a transition out of the Middle Ages and going into the modern age and where we need to be moving from here in order to further the cause of freedom, which will require strength and courage and not passivity. We haven't achieved freedom. We haven't created a stable freedom yet. So yet again, he's referring to that transition. He's talking about, he's got this idea that before cities arose, men were in a better position. There were men for a season, as he says, in the ancient world. Then came Christianity, on which he hangs all of his problems. And Christianity transvalued those values and made things, as Nietzsche would put it, flipped society on its head. And since then, we've been suffering the consequences of that. Yeah, he makes a mention of the Faust. Faust was the prototype of the Middle Ages, but not the Faustus of whom Kit Marlowe tells, who is, I guess he made a play based on Faust. But he's talking about a darker Faust, Gilles de Rais, who betrays the maid in his lust for power, and the maid being Joan of Arc. So Gilles de Rais was fighting alongside Joan of Arc, and then later on, after she had been long burnt at the stake and whatnot, he went about his aristocratic life and ended up torturing children, or at least being accused and tortured into confession and killed as a result of, or I don't know if he was imprisoned for life or killed, I can't remember, but I think he was killed because of apparently stealing the children of the poor people and torturing them and killing them and whatnot for his own amusement.
That's what's meant by he descends to the horror in his cellars. Mm-hmm. No, okay, so that's helpful because when I was reading this, Marlowe's most famous play is the Dr. Faustus play. There is a German Faust by Goethe, which I thought this was referring to at first, the darker Faust by, but this doesn't say Goethe, this says Gilles de Rais, and so it's helpful to know what he means by this, and that's clearer because he's saying it goes back to everything he was saying about the worst possible outcomes of the sex anxiety imposed upon people by the Catholic Church and by other churches by this time. That I guess his hypothesis is that Gilles de Rais might not have been what he was if he had been able to express his sexual curiosity more freely rather than having to become like, an untouchable aristocrat. And now I can do whatever I want and just be crazy and dangerous.
Yeah, it's almost like he's a representative of that product. When you have aristocracy ruling over the plebs, using this method of sexual repression, you end up with monsters growing in the dark.
It's a better way to parse it. Because say that this guy is arm of the law that commits this crime rather than a passive product of culture.
And then he goes through a series of people who he's referencing who I suppose are carrying the concept of freedom forward from Voltaire, but ultimately they essentially fail in the task, I think. He says in the end there, a beautiful vision fallen like a house of cards. You creators of the New Age, who dare not speak, think, or move without permission from the military, you unfettered titans who will hang for speaking across one border, where is your new world? Champions, where is freedom? What treasure have we lost? We must turn to women for that answer.
There's an amusing little mistake here. He says, we thought science would save us. That, in quotes, brave new world of Huxley, Darwin, and H.G. Wells. Somehow he read Brave New World and thought that it was optimistic. It isn't. The Brave New World that science promises is bad, and maybe that's what he means, but here it sounds like that the promise of the Brave New World failed.
Yeah.
When the promise of the Brave New World was just that it would fail. Yes, we turn to women for the answer for all the reasons we've already said.
And that's where he gives the key that lies back 10,000 years ago in the age of Isis. And that's where he makes the references. It wasn't a matriarchy. It was mistakenly referred to as a matriarchy, but it was actually an equality. Yeah, and I guess we'll get into a lot of what we've already been talking about here.
I feel like we're, and maybe it's because of the structure of the piece rather than anything we're doing. But I feel like in going over this kind of summation, we're running over a lot of trodden ground now. Unless there's anything really new to say, I think we should find a way out, maybe a quotation to finish on or something.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. I mean, he gives another little parallel history to go with the previous one of some of the men who carried, I imagine he's trying to say, or carrying freedom, the idea of freedom forward. He gives a parallel with women who were poisoners, and I don't know exactly what the motivation here is, except that they were trying to fight against this patriarchy and rebel against it, because the poisoners were sort of witch women, as he's referring to them, we have Messalina, who was the wife of Emperor Claudius, and was accused of licentiousness and I think of attempting to poison him and that sort of thing. And then we have some from the Middle Ages where it was Tophana, or the beginning of the Renaissance period or whatever, Tophana, Lavoisier, and de Brinvilliers, who he says raised revenge to a high art.
Yeah, so he admires this instinct, this revenge instinct, and
they were poisoners of husbands who were abusive.
Yeah, and I think that he's telling, his audience here, his intended audience, that he understands the instinct towards revenge, but later on he'll quickly say that know that all revenge is revenge on the self, and the most terrible is taken by the frigid woman. Count her in the tens of millions. The curse lies in the failure of her mate to be a man, and her failure to be true to herself. So even though he admires this instinct to revenge, and thinks that these 5 examples of women, including the Maid of Orleans, Jeanne d'Arc, are admirable figures, he's going to remind his reader that they're admirable figures who came to a bad end, and that any path to success is a path of forgiveness and requires working with men and teaching them a healthier attitude toward sex. You don't just poison your abuser and hope that he dies. You have to teach him not to abuse you or something. which, I mean, maybe some people in our audience are going to think that that's victim blaming. I don't think he means in specific cases. I think he means as a cultural project.
Yeah, it does seem like he's trying to make a point of, again, we need a transvaluation of values.
Yeah.
We need to keep reinforcing that.
Yeah. These women who were being like really, or like at least the example you gave of Miss Linnea, who was, you're saying she was in a bad condition with her husband and being sort of tormented. She did the right thing by killing him, but destroyed herself in the process. So, like, maybe if your spouse is really abusive, because like he says, we need to amend divorce laws so you can get out of there. You know, you don't stick around and teach directly the try to take a teaching role in a hopeless case, but that is a cultural project. That's where this kind of forgiveness and support and mutual support comes in.
Yeah, I mean there's that mention you had made of and the most terrible is that taken by the frigid woman. I feel like that frigid woman comes off as that has like a lot of baggage, that term nowadays, because it tends to mean like somebody who's cold and distant sexually, and it sounds like he's saying this in a bad light. But it's exactly what he's saying. He's saying that women, and I think this is coming out of like the Victorian age of Puritanism, with the idea of women feeling it necessary to repress their sexuality and hide it behind long black dresses and whatnot, and he's emphasizing the fact that we need to change that.
One of the most famous Greek comedy, Lysistrata, is about women who protest the war by refusing to have sex with their husbands, and then there's this ongoing critique of feminism, which I think is a bad critique. That says, women go too far. It's fine to fight for freedom, but you don't want to oppress men in the process. And I think that's what he's pointing at here, kind of, that freedom means freedom for all people, and that what we're fighting against is specifically the major problems in culture are caused by this sick attitude towards sex. And so if you try to be Lysistrata, you don't solve the problem. You're just expressing the same sick attitude towards sex. The point is not to swear off men entirely and, go be a man in the workplace and never have children because culture values male virtues more. The point is to for Parsons is to more fully realize yourself
it's
as a woman and the value of woman. And yes, and so frigidness is a kind of revenge, but it's also a revenge against the self, because it exacerbates the problem of sex anxiety.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a brief little strength is not born, it is gained by understanding and overcoming. Go free, sing the old wild song. Evoe, Io, Evoe Iacchus, Io Pan, Pan, Evoe Babylon. And so there's making direct reference to Babylon and Pan. So this is where he's really coming up into his big heralding of Babylon at the completion of the paper in a few paragraphs. Mm-hmm. And yeah, some of this is territory that we've already gone over. So like what you were saying about go free and joyously run naked and learn to appreciate your own beauty, even if you don't feel beautiful.
Yeah. Not just learn to appreciate your own beauty, but realize that running naked will make you more beautiful. Because exercise is healthy.
Yeah, and the way that you feel and think is going to affect the way that you are. It's going to manifest. That's pretty much what he's hinting at.
Yeah.
And then he gets into the woman is the priestess of the irrational world. Irrational, but how enormously important and how dangerous, because it is unadmitted or denied. We do not want to be drunken, murderous, frustrated, poverty-stricken, and miserable without cause. These conditions are not reasonable or scientific, quote-unquote, and yet they do exist. We say that we do not want war, but war seems a psychological necessity. Wars will continue until that need is otherwise fulfilled. So we're getting into a lot of this type of thing, like referencing the fact that, we say we don't want war, but it seems to be a necessity, and it seems to be an expression of something. And so if we were repressing these feelings and these parts of ourselves, then they're still going to find some expression.
That's a bit funny because I mentioned Lysistrata earlier and about the frigid woman and stuff. And the Freudian idea that we already talked about how all projects soever are sublimated sex instinct. So the solution to the problem of war is to have more sex, not less. To have a healthier attitude towards personal relationships, so there's less anxiety, which can express itself in conflict. I mean, I think there are wars over resources and wars over other types of political disputes. It's not all just like frustrated men hitting each other with sticks. But one wonders if there isn't some element of that, like we have all this energy that needs to go into a project, and wars for population control, where people get a peasantry and underclass, breeds too much and gets out of control. So aristocrats agree to have a little war to siphon some people off. I don't know if it still happens, but it's a documented thing from our deep history.
He's going to say this is all kind of in service as well to the woman girt with the sword that appears in the Book of the Law. And he's going to move on to that. Woman, put away unworthy weapons. Put away malice and poison, frigidity and childishness. Draw the two-edged sword of freedom and call for a man to meet you in fair combat. A man fit to be your husband and a father to your eagle brood. Call upon him, test him by the sword, and he will be worthy of you. Together you will be archetypes of the new race.
So it's worth going back to the title. Freedom is a two-edged sword, and the two edges being freedom for myself and freedom for all others. Again, this sort of bad criticism of feminism to say like, oh, women go too far, they want to oppress men and not just be free themselves. I think that's illiterate. But there is a question of when a revolutionary group who's used, freedom of expression, freedom of organization, freedom of, various freedoms to justify their ability to speak and to organize and politicize on behalf of a specific cause, that when that group starts to see themselves as the ruling class, any dissent against any criticism of the hard victories they've won, they're going to want to use those same tools of anti-speech, anti-liberalism to clamp down on criticism. So it wouldn't be that feminists are trying to restrict the freedom of men. I think that's stupid and illiterate. But that any revolutionary group that attains a certain measure of success, where it becomes where their values become enshrined in the ruling class, they then become hostile towards freedom generally, because they don't want anyone to be able to be critical of them the way they were critical of the previous power structure.
Yeah, any group that has to define itself by its opposition to something either transforms when the time is right or has to really reinforce that opposition.
But I think Parsons' criticism is the less refined criticism of saying, like, now that we have women in the workplace, let's not let the workplace become feminine and oppressive. Have the women take up the sword and fight for everyone's freedom and work together with men to improve the condition of culture more generally. And that's where he leaves it.
Evoy Babylon. To you, O unknown woman, is the sword of freedom pledged. And that's the end of the paper.
Thank you, Darren. That was fun.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm glad we were able to complete this and come back to it. I'm glad we didn't just leave it hanging like that, because there was a lot of interesting stuff to cover in those last few chapters there.
Yeah, no, I like it. I think it's a good paper. I am inspired by some of the poetic language, criticism aside. I mean, people will differ on political issues and social issues and stuff like that, so...
and I don't think that differing on something should prevent people from speaking and expressing. I think it's important to express.
Any complaint I have about Parsons' incomplete and over-prescriptive brand of feminism is not a negation of the value and the general beauty of the piece. I mean, so much of it is so feels so nice in the mouth, even.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the problem he points at, or the series of problems he's trying to point at, are real problems, I think, and it's and there's truthiness in a lot of what he points at.
Yeah, and you wanted to avoid in first talking about this, just sort of saying, well, is this still true today? Yes, it is, and that sort of thing. But it is continuously important and relevant.
It's not that I wanted to avoid talking about that. I just thought that might be the only thing we had to say.
We didn't want it to just be
I didn't realize how expansive it was going to get in the third and fourth chapter, because the first chapter really is just a political analysis of a condition where people are sexually repressed, and that makes them repressed more generally. And
yeah, the following couple of chapters did feel very flowery and kind of like they were saying in 100 words what could have been said in 5, that kind of thing. But no, that wasn't the case at all. There was a lot to explore there.
Well, it was difficult to pull the arguments. The way in which sex becomes a weapon for the church, and the way in which women become the solution for this problem. I think in the first case, it's expressed sort of over too wide a breadth, so you have to pull quotes from lots of places in order to organize the argument. And in the second place, it's so counterintuitive to what it's frankly what I think outside of the Overton window now. You wouldn't be able to talk about this except in reference to a paper, because it just seems like abhorrent and misogynist. And so for a person to come from a feminist perspective and express things that now seem misogynist, it just took a long time for me to wrap my head around. So those two arguments were, I wouldn't have been able to understand them a month ago when we recorded the first part. Now I think I do.
Yeah, got a very much different perspective on the overall paper now than after having done a first reading of it. Well, thank you very much, Mike, for joining me again on this one, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Darren. Love is the law.
Love under will. Thank you for joining us. Look for Toronto Thelema on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Watch for events in the city, and join us again in the darkly splendid abodes.